Hello and welcome to EE233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take a look at another example in our fundamentals demo. This video assumes that you have already worked on your interactive _01, and this is sort of a little bit of a tangent or an alternate way of accomplishing the same thing that we accomplished in our interactive _01. And this also gives us a chance to explore command line arguments a little bit more. So to begin with, I'm going to go ahead and let you take a look at this this snip here. There's not a lot to it, and there will not be a lot to this one. But if you do not have a copy of it, go ahead and take a second to go ahead and jot down this code. And as with the earlier videos, we simply want to go ahead and bring in our function prototype and our function implementation into our fundamentals.c. And once again, this is a kind of a long function signature, but this particular function isn't really going to have a whole lot to it. The main challenge with this one is actually going to be in our main. Now, before we take a look at the main, what we want to do is take a look at the function implementation here. You'll notice that, like the interactive _01 that we worked on earlier, this basically captures or tries to utilize the first name, the last name, the course department, and the course number. This time, however, though, we are not going to use a scanf to capture the information from the user. Somehow it's going to be provided to us. And at least from the perspective of our function, our parametric _01 has no idea how you got the information. It just simply knows that it's going to get 4 pieces of information. And the idea is we simply want to, once again, print out the information to a nice formatted output. In this case, all we're going to do inside this function is going to print hello, %s, just like we did in the earlier example, and welcome to %s, %d. And we're just simply going to fill those 4 placeholders with the 4 values that are being passed as arguments to our function. In this case, our first _name, our last _name, our course department, and our course number. Now, I will make a comment here. We are ignoring a number of issues, not the least of which is we need to do some error checking. Now, we're not going to do that in this video, but things that we will want to consider, for instance, is the first name, the length of the first name greater than 0, and is the length of the last name greater than 0, length of the course department, and so on, as well as is the course number a positive value, so on. There's some basic error checking that even in this simple example we could do, but we're going to completely ignore it. We're going to assume that somehow the user has managed to put in the right information. Instead, what we want to do is we want to focus on our main and how we're going to call this function, because essentially this function assumes blindly that it has all of the correct information being passed to it. So ideally there would be more to this function. So let's come up to main real quick. Before we go too much further, we probably should just take just a second to go ahead and build it, just to make sure that we do in fact have valid C code. That looks good. And so what we want to do is we want to add on an additional else if. And what we want to do is we want to think about the conditions under which we would like to call our parameter _01 or parametric _01. Now, the first thing to note is that somehow we want to get the information from the user. And so at this point, outside in our main would be a good place to go ahead and capture the information. So what we'd like to do here is have an else if, and then a string compare I, where we simply look at our argv square brackets 1. And if the user, in fact, asks for the parametric mode _01, Then what we want to do is we want to make a call to our parametric underscore 01. But there's a problem. We don't have all of the arguments. And so as a matter of fact, if you try to build this real quick, it's going to be unsuccessful because we are not calling parametric with the correct number of arguments. Now, what we want to do is we want to take a look at that function signature one more time. And we'll recognize that we need to provide it 4 pieces of information. And we've got a couple of ways that we can go about doing this. And the first way we're going to do it is we're going to create some temporary variables, very much like the ones that we used in the interactive underscore 01. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a char first underscore name, and I'm going to go ahead and make it 10 characters with the same conversation that we had earlier, that's supposed to be for 9 characters plus an end of string. We also want to have a char last name. We're going to make that 10 characters long as well. A char course underscore department. And we're going to make that 3. And then lastly, an integer of the course number. Now, one thing to note, it is coincidental that we are using the same variable names. That is not a requirement. We could have simply abbreviated this to F underscore name, L underscore name, C underscore department, and C underscore number, just to prove the point. I like to keep my variable names consistent. However, it is important to note that the variables in the parametric underscore 01 function signature aren't the same variables, or variables names rather, or they do not need to be the same variable names as the ones you use for your temporary variables. Now, coming down here into our else if, we want to capture the information from the user. So inside the branch here of this else if, we capture the information from the user, and then we make a call to our output function. Well, to capture the information from the user, like in our interactive underscore 01, just simply involves using printf with some friendly messages such as please enter a first name, followed by a new line, and then a scanf that captures that first name using the %s as the placeholder, and then the address of the first name variable. Remember to use that ampersand. We can do the same thing now with the last name. So please enter a last name, followed by a scanf with a %s and ampersand last name. Continuing on, very, very similar to our interactive underscore 01. Please enter a course description, a course department rather, and a scanf, once again, using that %s for the format, and the ampersand course department for the variable. Do not forget those ampersands when you're using your scanfs. And then lastly, please enter a course number. Now remember that our course number is different than the previous pieces of information in that we're expecting an integer. So it's going to be a %d, and once again, ampersand then and course number. Now, at this point, this part looks identical to our interactive underscore 01. What we'd like to do, assuming that we also later on include some error checking, we would like to pass these variables to our function. And so to begin with, we want to pass our first name as the first input argument. the last name as the second input argument, the course department as our third input argument, and lastly, our course number as the final input argument. Now, if we were to build this one, you'll see that we are in fact successful. We are calling this parametric underscore 01 with the correct number of arguments. And this also gives us an opportunity to look at our help one more time. So what we can do now is we can make a copy of our help for the interactive and just simply change it to the parametric. And this calls the parametric. All right, one last time, build it. Test it to see whether our new switch shows up in the help. Sure enough, it does. And then test our switch itself. So in this case, it's going to be parametric underscore 01. And just like in the interactive example, we're being prompted for entering in the first name, Gregory, last name, Myers, the course department, EE, the course number, 233. And you'll see, there we go. We have our nice formatted message. But we aren't done. Remember I said we don't really care how our parametric underscore 01 gets its information as long as it gets it. Well, that means that there's a second way that we can utilize our parametric underscore 01, and that is by providing the information utilizing the command line arguments. So what I'd like to do is take just a second to refresh our memory on how the command line arguments work. Particularly remember that in C, the name of the executable will always be the 0th argument. So in other words, our count will always be 1. Now, if we want to provide to our parametric underscore 01 function additional pieces of information, we need to provide the switch plus 4 pieces of information for a total argument count of 6. That probably is a little surprising, but if you count through it, you'll think about it. We have the 0th argument being the name of the executable. The argument at index 1 is going to be the parametric underscore 01 switch, followed by the 4 pieces of information we wish to pass to that function. So what we can do now is we can go back to our else if and add another case or another option here. And this is actually going to be a compound option. In this case, it's going to be else if, and we start off with a string compare I, argv, square brackets 1, and we want to compare this to our parametric underscore 01 equal to 0, but that only gets us partially solving the problem. We also want to look at the argument count. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to specify a double ampersand and our argc equal to 6. Now, it doesn't really matter in which order you do this. However, if we don't have 6 arguments, there's no purpose in checking to see if the first one is our parametric underscore 01. You could also think of it the other way around, in that if we don't have parametric underscore 01, why bother to check to see how many arguments we have? Either logic holds in this case. Now, assuming that we have the switch as well as the argument count, how do we get those arguments to our parametric underscore 01 function? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can do this. The first way is to use a function called string copy, and to copy all of the arguments into the strings that we have already been using. So in this case, we would have string copy underscore first name, and we would simply use the contents of argv square brackets 2 and copy that into the first name variable. You're probably wondering why argv square brackets 2. Well, once again, argv square brackets 0 is the executable. Argv square brackets 1 is the first switch, or the slash parametric. The argv square brackets 2 then would be the first parameter that was going to be passed to our function. We can continue this now to do a string copy, last name, and argv square brackets 3, because the last name comes after the first name. Continuing on, we can do string copy, course underscore department, and capture the argv square brackets 4. And then we're faced with that last argument. Well, we could do string copy and then course underscore integer, but there's a problem. Course underscore number, but the problem is that and I've kind of given it away here, the course number is in fact an integer, so there's no copying of strings. Instead, what we need to do is somehow convert that argv square brackets 5 into an integer. And to do that, there's actually a couple of ways in C, but one way to do it is to use a function called a to I. And a to I allows for you to convert a string into an integer. And I'm going to quickly show the Wikibook's help here. You'll see that it allows for you to accept an input argument of a string, and it returns an integer. When a to I encounters a string with no numerical sequence, it returns a 0. In a later video, we'll show how to address this in error checking. But for now, what we want to do is we simply want to use the a to I function to capture our course underscore number, which is going to be equal to a to I of our argv square brackets 5. Now, if I go ahead and build this, it should go ahead and compile. And at this point, then the only thing left for us to do is to make a call to our parametric underscore 01. And in this case, what we want to do is we simply provide the first name as the first argument, the last name as the second argument, the course department as the third, and lastly, the course number as the fourth. Once again, taking a look at the similarities between these two, in this example, we're simply using printfs and scanfs to collect the information, whereas in this case, we're collecting it from the command line. Now, let's go ahead and build this. And let's go ahead and update our help. So in this case, what we want to do is we're going to add a little bit more information here, some extra switches, and we'll give them an example here, or rather extra arguments. So I'm going to go ahead and specify Gregory space Myers, EE space 233. And this is going to be calls parametric underscore 1 using command line arguments. All right, so let's see what happens. We'll go ahead and build it. And let's test this out. So there's our switch slash parametric underscore 1, Gregory space Myers, EE233, and hit enter. And you'll see that it identified all of the arguments, but it still prompts me to enter my first name. And so we're just going to put a little bit of nonsense in here. Why is that? Well, let's take a second to look back at our logic in our main. If you'll notice, I first checked to see if my argv square brackets 1 is equal to parametric underscore 01, which means I fall into this condition before I ever reach this second condition. So we've got a couple of ways that we can handle this. We can either have a nested if statement, or what we can simply do is move the checking or the testing of this scenario, since it is a little bit more restrictive, above the parametric 01. So in other words, if we have a scenario where our parametric underscore 01 is equal to 0 and our argc is equal to 6, then we want to call it this way. If by some reason we only got the parametric underscore 01 equal to 0 and we didn't provide the correct number of input arguments, then we would simply use the scanf and the printf. Now, you could also argue that what you would want to do here would be to further restrict this scenario. And specifically here, we would simply say argc then is going to be equal to 2, the name of the executable and the switch, so that any other scenario involving parametric underscore 01 would not be handled, or would essentially result in printing help. So let's go ahead and build this. Now let's come back out to our command window. We'll simply hit the up arrow, and once again, you'll see that it recognizes all 6 of the arguments, but more importantly, it doesn't run the print and scanf statements. Instead, it jumps straight to calling our function with the welcome message. So once again, I hope you found this video useful. As always, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.